Hello and welcome to another video. In this video we're going to continue on with Typescript line 75 and we're going to be doing set matrix zeros. In this problem you're given an n by n matrix and you basically want to, for every zero in the matrix, you want to zero out the whole row and column of that zero. So what that would look like in this first example is there's 0 here, so we're going to get rid of that, and this should all be zeros as you can see. And here, for this 0 you would want to zero this out, and for this 0 you'd want to zero this out. So the problem with this problem is if I zero something out, how do I actually remember that I zeroed it out, right? Because for example here, let's say I see a 0 and I zero this out. Well, how do I know if I have any more zeros? It'll all be zeros, so should I zero out everything? And that's kind of the hard thing about this problem. How do I keep track of information? And we're going to focus on the in-place solution for this one. It is a little bit easier if you do like an O of n, if you have an n plus m solution, and I can briefly talk about that one. Essentially what you do is you just go through all of this, and then you would have an array of rows and an array of columns, and then every time you encounter a 0, so for example, you'd have an array of rows like this. I can briefly talk about it. And let's say there are 3 rows, right? So it'll be like 0, 1, 2, and we're gonna set all those values equal to, let's say, false in the beginning. And then for the columns, there are 4 columns, so we will have 4 columns, and we're also going to set those equal to false. And essentially, as we go through the rows, so like we'd go through this, we'd see, okay, there's a 0 at index 0, 0. So what's index 0, 0? Well, it's row 0 and column 0, so we found a 0. So essentially, all we have to do is we just have to change these values to true every time we encounter zeros in their corresponding row and column. We can just set it equal to true. And so here you would also write a 0, right? So this is row 0, column 3. So row 0 is already true, and then column 3 would be here. And then basically all you would do is you would check your rows. You would say like, okay, which one is true? I have to zero out that row, right? So row 0 is true, so I have to zero out this row. And column 0 is true, so I have to zero out this column. And column 3 is true, so I have to zero out that column. And by using these 2 arrays, you're not losing any information. But it's going to be harder if we can't use these, and let me show you why here. So let's actually draw down this matrix here, and let's kind of realize what issues we are into and why this problem is annoying if you try to do it in place. Okay. So we're going to have this, and then we are going to have 4 columns. So 1, 2, 3, 4. There we go. And then we are going to have 1. Actually, there we go. 0, 1, 2, 3, 0, 1, 2. There are the rows and the columns. And now let's write down the values. So 0, 1. Actually, let's use different color there just to make it easier as well. So 0, 1, 2, 0, 3, 4, 5, 2, 1, 3, 1, 5. And so the problem, if we can't keep track of like which rows and columns have zeros, if we can't just have an array for each of them, how, like, what else do we do, right? Like, we can't just like change things when we encounter zeros. Because let's just say if we change, right, like the naive approach would be like, okay, well, every time we encounter 0, we can just set that row and column to 0, and then we can just keep going. Well, the problem is, if you set all of these to 0 as soon as you encounter this first 0, let's say, then you would go to this number, let's say, and you'd be like, okay, well, should I make this 0 as well because I encountered a 0? Like, how do I know if I encountered a 0 or if it's a previous 0 or what, right? You lose a lot of information when you change things. So you need to change your stuff, but to also somehow keep track of what zeros you have so you don't just like delete everything. And you can't just say like, okay, when I see a 0, I'm going to set the row and a column to 0, and I'm going to skip that row, for example, because we also need to set this column to 0, right? And how do we know if this 0 was made first, or or if it was made because of zeroing this out, or what? Like, it's very difficult, right? So the key to this problem is figuring out the way to do things in the right order, and also noticing that if you change something, you can lose information, right? Like if you say like I encounter 0 and I turn everything else into zeros, how do I know if those are new zeros or old zeros? Because that matters, right? because for every old 0, you need to turn the row and the column to 0, but for every new 0, you don't need to do anything. And so the key to this problem is we are going to treat this first row and this first column differently than everything else. So what we're going to do is actually we're going to go through this first row and we're going to see, are there any zeros? And then we're going to make a variable called, like, let's just call it RZ for row zeros. And if we do encounter a 0, then we want to set it either to true or false, whatever you want, really. It's up to you. So essentially, what we're going to need to do there is we're going to set it to some variable. Initially, we'll set it to false, and then if we encounter 0, we'll set it to true. So we're going to go through this first row, and then we did see a 0, so we're going to make it true. Now we're going to go through this first column, and we did see a 0 as well, so we're going to make that true. So column 0 is going to be true. And this way, now we can use this row and column freely to store information, because we know that we have to zero out this row and this column later on, and we only use 2 variables for that, right? And it's always going to be only 2 variables for this. Now, essentially, we have to do the next part, and what we have to do is we can use this row and this column now. We can freely manipulate them, because if some of these get changed to zeros, we still know that the row and the column need to become zeros later on, so it's totally fine. So what we're going to do is we're actually going to traverse this part, right? Not touching that. And for every 0 we encounter, we will just set its appropriate row and column to 0. So for example, if we encountered a 0 here, we would set this to 0 and this to 0. And then later on, we can just traverse this first row and this first column and say, every 0 we found is a relevant 0, and we need to set that whole row to 0. And every 0 we find here is a relevant 0, so we need to set that whole column to 0. So we would traverse this section, and we'd say, okay, in our case, we found no zeros. That's fine. So what do we do next, right? Like, obviously, you might have a case where, or let's just actually change it. Let's say this was a 0, right? Just to change it a little bit. Let's say this was a 0. Well, if this was a 0, like I said, we are going to change the row and the column for that 0 to 0. So this is going to become 0, and this is going to become 0, right? And we can actually write that we change this to a 0 just to show, like, just to think of like what that would look like in a final solution here. Okay. So now that we set the rows and the columns for everything in here to zeros, just to signal that they need to be zeroed out, now we actually need to go through this row and this column and zero out everything that has been set to 0. So we're going to go through this row, right? And we're going to zero out everything that has been set to 0, essentially. So let's go through this row, not counting this element, right? This is like a special element where, like, there is no inner row or column for this one, but we're just going to go through this part of the row. So let's do that, right? So what we need to do is we need to go through it, and we need to say, okay, well, if this row is a 0, then we're going to set this entire thing to 0. So this is a 0, so we're going to set this entire thing to 0. This is a 2, so we can go on, and this is a 0, so we're going to need to set this entire thing to 0. Okay. Now we're going to do the same thing for the column, so we're going to go down. This is a 0. But remember, we're not going to start at this column because we don't want to override the row. We're going to start at this column here. So we're going to say, okay, this column is 0. Okay, that's great. So we need to set this entire thing to 0. This column was 1, so we didn't do anything. So now we essentially made all of these elements the correct thing. But we still haven't figured out, like, what we need to do with this row and this column. Well, remember we said we are going to zero out the row and we're going to zero out the column because there was a 0 originally in there. So now we go through this and we would zero this out and we would zero this out. And that would be kind of our final solution. And let's take a look at what that would look like if we didn't do that, right? So we know this row and this column needs to get zeroed out. Also, this whole thing needs to get zeroed out, right? So this needs to be 0, 0, 0, 0. And what else needs to get zeroed out? So this needs to get zeroed out, and this needs to get zeroed out, and this needs to get zeroed out because of this. So that is correct. Now let's actually go back and change this 0 into what it originally was, and let's make sure that part is correct as well, right? So it was a 4. Okay. So remember, we go through this, and we set this is like the special row, and this is the special column. So we go through this, and we set every row and column that, this element is a 0 for to 0. So we go through it. We didn't find anything. Okay. Now we are going to go through the row and the column, like I said originally, and anytime it's a 0, we're going to zero out the row, and anytime this is a 0, we're going to zero out the column. So we go through the row. not this element here, everything else. So not 0, not 0. This is 0. So we need to zero out this whole row. So this is 0 and 0. Now we go through the columns, not this one, remember. Not 0, not 0. And now we check, is our row true? Yes, that means this whole row needs to be zeros. So 0, 0. And is the column true? Yes, that means this column needs to be zeros. And now you can see we have what we want. So let's repeat what we need to do. 1, check topmost row and column, or first row and column, to see if they need to be zeroed out. Okay. 2, loop through all elements not in first row or first column, and if the element is 0, then set its first row and column to 0. Then loop through first row, and if it's 0, 0 out that column, and then loop. So let's go down a little, right? So we loop through the first row. Let's actually do this. Right, so if we loop through the first row, we would loop like this, and then if the row is 0, we would zero out the column. So loop through first row, not counting first element, and if it's 0, zero out that column, then do the same thing for the column, right? So loop through first column, not counting first element, and if it's 0, 0 out that row. So same thing, right? We loop through this row, essentially, right here, or loop through this first column, and for every 0 value, we would zero out that row. Then finally, 0 out first row if RZ is true, and 0 out first call if CZ is true, or whatever you want to call that, right? And so that's how you do it. That's basically the logic for it. And I know it's kind of weird in place, but yeah, that's basically what you have to do. You have to make sure to figure out, like, are these zeros or are they not? Then you look through everything else and you set their rows to zeros appropriately. Then you go through this row and this column to actually set all these to 0 if they are zeros. And then finally you set the row and the column to 0 if they were 0 to begin with. And that would do it in place. Okay, so let's actually code that up now. So we are going to make like this row zeros and column zeros first. So we're going to say let row zeros was false, and call zeros. And it is kind of confusing, and there are a lot of for loops, which is kind of annoying, but you can't really do much about that. So remember, the first thing we're going to do is we're going to loop through the first row, let's say, or we have to loop through the first row and the first column, right? And if there's a value that's 0, we have to mark the row zeros or column zeros to true appropriately, knowing to tell us that we are going to mark that first row or this first column with 0. Okay, so we're going to say let I equals 0. And I is less than... Oh, we need to do one more thing that we're going to use. So we want to actually use rows and columns, actually get these values, because we are going to use them a bunch. So rows, the number of rows is matrix.length, and the number of columns is matrix 0.length. And they are guaranteed to be at least 1, so matrix 0 can't be like undefined or anything. Because we are going to use this a bunch, so might as well store the value. So now we need to actually say, okay, we are going to go through all of the rows. And we're going to do I++. And we're going to check if it's 0, right? So we're going to go through... Essentially, what are we doing? We are going through all of the rows here, and if any one of these is 0 for column 0, then we need to zero out the columns, right? So if matrix I 0 equals, and this is probably actually better to rename row, so like this. So if matrix row 0 equals 0, that means we need to zero out the column. So we can just say call zeros equals true. Okay. Let's fix that, and this needs to be row. And this needs to be row as well. So that's essentially, like I said, we are just going through all of the rows for column 0, and if any one of these is 0, that means we are going to set this equal to true and 0 out the columns. We need to do the same thing for the rows, so we're going to say let call equal 0, calls less than calls, call plus plus. And we need to do that before we flag these, to show that we need to delete the row. Because if some of these are zeros, like in this case, right, if we don't flag them, then this 0 is going to turn this row, or this value to 0 and this value to 0, so we can't flag them later. So we have to flag first, then we go through these and we say, like, okay, this is a 0. That means we're going to flag this to 0 and this to 0. That way, when we go through them later, we're going to say, oh, look, here's a 0, so we need to make all this zeros. And here's 0, so we need to make all this zeros. Okay. So if matrix 0 column equals 0, then same thing, right? Row zeros equals true. Okay, so now we flag those. So now we actually need to go through this entire this entire thing apart from this first row and this first column. So this section here or this section here. So let's do that. So we're going to say for let row equals, and then we're going to say let's let row equals 1, right? We don't want to flag the row, so yeah, the row equals 1, row is less than rows, row plus plus, and we are going to have one more loop in here. So for let call equals 1, call is less than calls, call plus plus. And then we are going to say if matrix row call equals 0, then we are going to need to flag its corresponding row and column. Right? So let's do that. So matrix, matrix row. So we're going to need to flag the row first. 0 equals 0, and also matrix 0 call equals 0. Probably need to have a thing here. Like that. So there we go. This one's definitely a decent amount of code. Like, it's not super difficult, but it's just a ton of code. Okay, so now we need to loop through the rows and the columns, essentially, right? And actually flag those as well, right? So we're going to say, we probably want to loop them, right? So we're going to say, okay, well, for let row equals 1, row is less than rows, and then row plus plus. And then we can just loop through the columns as well. So actually, let's just loop through all the rows, right, first. So we're going to loop through all of the rows, and then we're going to say, okay, if this row is actually 0, right? So yeah, if this row, actually it's this way, if this row is 0, then we'll 0 out the rest of it, pretty much. So the way we're going to actually do that instead, though, is instead of looping through these, we are actually just going to loop through the rest of this again, and we're just going to check for the row, or like instead of looping through the row and saying, okay, if this is 0, let's loop through the rest, we're actually just going to loop through these again and say if the row or the column for it is 0, then let's make it 0. So we can basically reuse this code here. And then we can just say if matrix 0, right? So if the row or the column equals 0, or matrix call. Actually, this should be call. Definitely easy to make mistakes in this one, so hopefully I didn't, but we'll see. So row 0 equals 0. Then we are going to set it equal to 0. So this is row call equals 0. Okay, there we go. So now we did that. So now what we need to do is we need to actually, so we zeroed out all of these, but now we actually need to zero out the row and the column, right? So let's do that. So we're going to say if row zeros, we need to zero out the row. So let's do that. So for let call equals 0, call is less than calls, call plus plus, let's just zero everything out there. So matrix, yes, it's going to be matrix row 0 and call equals 0, right? Because the row is going to be row 0 always, but we're just moving down the columns. And basically the same thing for the columns. So if call zeros, then we do the row. So row, 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 and rows. Okay, now we pray to God that it worked. And it didn't. Okay, so let's go through what happened actually. Let's see how we're off here. Okay, so it looks like we are a bit off, but we are right on one of them, which is interesting. Okay, so let's go through this. This is going to be a lot. Okay, so we are going through the row if matrix row 0. So this part's fine. If we are going through the columns, if matrix 0 call, that part is fine. Okay, if matrix ij equals 0, matrix row 0 equals 0. Just make this a little cleaner. Okay. Yeah, that part is fine. I wonder if these need to be 0. I don't think so. So let's say like this is 0. What would be the column? Yeah, I don't think that would matter at all. I mean, we could try it, but I don't think it would matter. Let's see here. Yeah. Okay. So I think I'm just missing like a row and a column somewhere where I just like reversed it accidentally. So if matrix ij or row column is 0, then this is 0. That's fine. Then we are looping through the rows and the columns, which is fine. So if matrix 0 column is 0, yeah, or if matrix, that part is fine too. Yeah. So for call, that part's fine. Okay, I think here it is. Let's pray to God, that's it. Okay, nice. Okay, so you can see it's a lot more efficient now. You can probably make this in less loops, maybe. It's kind of hard though, because essentially you have to do these steps, right? You have to mark these rows, you have to use the row and the column in place essentially to mark which rows need to get zeroed out. And then finally, you need to actually zero out this section and then zero out the row and the column. So for the time and space, it's going to be big O of n times m. We are just looping like a bunch of times. Like we have a nested for loop, not here. So this is just O of n or O of m, whatever one of those. But here we have a nested for loop. Here we have a nested for loop. So essentially you have like a few nested for loops, so it's n by m. And space, we are doing it in place, right? We're just changing the values. So yeah, I guess they do tell you must do it in place. But they did also say that you can have an m plus n space, you can have an mn space. So I think the constant space one is not super easy for this one, to be honest. I'd say it's kind of like on the tough end of the medium problems. It's not really an algorithms per se. It's more of just like a, can you figure out clever techniques? But hopefully you liked it. And if you did, please like the video and subscribe to the channel. And I'll see you in the next one. Thanks for watching.